Hi, and welcome back to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about some other measures of unemployment besides the standard unemployment rate, U3, starting with the labor force participation rate. So, in a previous video, we talked about the effect of something called discouraged workers when they enter or leave the labor force. What happens to the unemployment rate? Well, now it's time to complete our conversation of labor force participation by looking at this rate. And it's a pretty simple one. You take the size of the labor force, the number of people in the labor force, and you divide that by what's called the adult population. So, the labor force we described in the previous video, that is people who are employed with either part-time or full-time work, and people who are unemployed, who don't have work but who have looked for work in the past 4 weeks. Those are people in the labor force. Adult population is everybody over the age of 16 who is able to work, who could physically be working. That's what we call the adult population. And the reason why we care about the labor force participation rate is because it shows us a much more complete picture of the employment situation. Again, in the previous video that we made, just because the unemployment rate is going down does not necessarily mean that good things are happening. Some people might be getting frustrated and leaving the labor force entirely. So, the one thing that I will note is that the labor force participation rate is not as heavily reported as the unemployment rate. So if you were to see a headline about the employment situation in the US, you'd see the unemployment rate probably right there in the title. But you'd have to scroll down pretty far into the article to see the labor force participation rate if you find it at all. A lot of times they don't even include it, but it's really worth talking about. So here's a diagram. This might look familiar. This is from a previous video. Let's see if we can calculate the labor force participation rate, remembering that that is the labor force divided by the adult population. So you can pause the video if you'd like to, because I'm going to give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. So in this situation, the labor force participation rate would be about 63.71%, because you take the size of the labor force, that's 155 million employed plus unemployed, and you divide by the size of the adult population, that's everybody, and that's going to give you 243.3 million people, and you're going to come out with that answer right there. So how has the labor force participation rate changed over time? Well, this is annualized information, so they do collect this every month, but this is just looking at yearly stats because it smooths out the graph a little bit. Since the 1940s, you can see that for the most part, the labor force participation rate has gone up. More people in the adult population have entered the labor force, meaning they've either started working or looking for work. And it peaked sometime around the year 2000, late 1990s, and it has declined since then. It took a big hit in 2009. So when that recession happened, the gray area is the recession, and we haven't learned about recessions yet, but this is just bad economic times, let's say. The labor force participation rate usually goes down because it's harder to find a job and more people just leave the labor force. Maybe they retire earlier than they were going to or some other reason. And the labor force participation rate really hasn't recovered from this recession right here. We have not gotten back to our pre-recession levels. So that's a little bit about the labor force participation rate. Another thing to consider when talking about the unemployment situation is something called underemployment. Underemployed means that you're, for instance, working a part-time job, but you would prefer to be working a full-time job. The official way that they say this is part-time for economic reasons, meaning you're trying to find a full-time job, but for whatever reason you can only find part-time work. Or it might mean that you're overqualified for your job. You hold maybe an advanced degree and you're working a menial job. So underemployed people still count as employed because they have a job, right? Anybody with a part-time or full-time job is considered employed, so they're not going to show up in the U3 because they're just an employed person. Fortunately though, the BLS has another measure for these types of people called the U6. The U6 is the broadest rate measure of unemployment that we have. Let's take a look. So the green line here is the U3, the unemployment rate. We looked at that before. And the blue line is U6. So that is unemployed and discouraged workers and people who are employed part-time for economic reasons. So it's again, captures everybody. So this one's going to be much higher than the actual unemployment rate. Whoops, let me go back there. So looking at this information, you can see when the recession hit, yes, the unemployment rate went up quite a bit, but the U6 went up even more. right? Lots of people who were fortunate enough to even find part-time work would have rather have been working in full-time jobs. Okay, now it's time for the Unemployment Situation Report. So the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, publishes this usually on the first Friday of the month, pretty much. So for instance, for March 2020, the stats for that month came out on April 3rd, 2020. That's the first Friday in April. And that was a historically significant one because of all the effects of coronavirus are now finally starting to be reflected in the economic data. Now, again, this is the employment stuff for March, and in the first 3 days of April, they're publishing it. A lot of time, data is kind of slow to come in, and so what they often do later on in the month is they revise. They publish a revision of the unemployment situation. So later in April, you'll see them publish a revision to the March 2020 data, either revising the numbers up or down, or maybe somehow the same. So there are two components to the unemployment situation report. First, there's the household survey data. This is the stuff we've already talked about, stuff like the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, etc. But the new one that we're going to talk about now is the establishment survey data. This is what's commonly referred to in the media as the jobs report. What they do for this one is they survey about 145,000 businesses and government agencies, because remember, our government's pretty big. A lot of people work for our government. And altogether with this number, this covers about 40 million total workers. So it's a huge sample of American workers. And what they're trying to figure out is, for these employers, these businesses, how many jobs did they add? How many jobs did they lose? And they take the difference there, right? So if a firm added 10, but they lost 4, then that's going to count as a positive 6. Now, this can give you some different results from the household survey data. You think everything would line up perfectly, but there are some discrepancies for some different reasons. First of all, let's say that you got 2 part-time jobs, and both of your jobs were at businesses that contribute to this jobs report. You would actually be counted as 2 new jobs, even though you're just one person. So that's something that's a little bit different, right? When they call you for the household survey data, they're asking you if you have a job. They're not necessarily asking you how many jobs you have. And then the other thing is, if you're a self-employed person, then you're not going to show up in the establishment survey data because they don't necessarily call self-employed people. So it's important to know how I know it sounds a little dry sometimes, but it's important to know how these statistics are created because they get published. Politicians talk about them to prove whatever point they're trying to prove, not always correctly. And we'd like to think that they're doing everything in good faith, but that's not always true. So it's important as a citizen to inform yourself about how these statistics are created so that you can know better. Now, the jobs report, again, is, change in how many people, how many jobs are added, right? So again, if it's more jobs were added than the jobs lost, we're going to be above this black line. And if more jobs were lost than were added, we're going to be below this black line. And each one of these little columns in this bar chart is a month. Now, the United States, I believe, was at its longest streak in history. Since I think about 2010, 2011, every single month was above the black line. We were always adding more jobs than we had lost. And this bar over here, which you almost don't notice at first, is March of 2020. Not a good month, right? So the streak has definitely been broken. And in 1 month, we've managed to match almost the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. Of course, this is all due to coronavirus. This might snap back, but it's pretty stark. Now, jobless claims is one more measure that we can use to measure the unemployment rate. So when people lose their jobs, they can file for what's called unemployment insurance. You might know it as unemployment benefits or jobless claims. It's all the same thing. And the Department of Labor tracks this. When you apply for unemployment insurance, you don't apply to the Federal Department of Labor, you apply to your state's Department of Labor, but they report that information to the US Department of Labor. So long story short, if you lose your job and you file for unemployment insurance to get benefits, then that information is going to find its way to the US Department of Labor, and they track this to see how the economy is doing as well. This graph is equally insane as the last one. So this graph goes back to about 1960, more or less here. And every month they're seeing how many people for the first time filed for unemployment benefits. And the number is typically around 400,000 Americans a month are, have lost their job and they're filing for unemployment benefits. Well, that's all pretty consistent, pretty consistent. Of course, every recession that happens, more and more people become unemployed, so more and more people ask their government for assistance while they try to find a new job. And there's the giant recession of 2009, the worst since the Great Depression in many ways, and that seemed like a pretty big spike in jobless claims until, again, March 2020. It's pretty easy to miss. This is March of 2020. So, February 2020, 211,000 people for the first time filed a jobless claim. In March 2020, 2,666,750 new jobless claims. I'm pretty sure it's a record for 1 month. Again, this is all hopefully temporary due to coronavirus, but these are extremely unusual times when this line makes the Great Recession of 2009 look just like a little blip in the radar. So, in summary, we've learned about actually 6 different ways that we can describe the unemployment situation. The unemployment rate, U3, unemployment rate plus discouraged workers, U4, labor force participation rate, unemployment rate plus discouraged workers, plus underemployed workers, which is the U6, establishment survey data, what we call that jobs report, payrolls report, and initial unemployment insurance claims, that jobless claims from the previous slide. Truthfully, there are even more measures out there than that, but those are some of the major ones that get reported, and thus those are the ones that we should know if we're trying to figure out information about the unemployment situation in the United States. So, thank you very much for watching.